She doesn't belong here. Staff Sergeant Odom Hollis said it flat, without heat, the way a man reads a weather report, and the 11 men crowded into the briefing tent took it as settled. Outside, the wind came off the harbor and dragged the smell of diesel and salt through the canvas, and rain that couldn't decide to fall beaded on the map table. Hollis tapped the plastic overlay where the port district bled red. Overwatch on the mole needs a shooter who can hold nerve when it gets loud, not a range trophy, not a checkbox they mailed us so a general can smile in a photo. He didn't look at her when he said it. He never did. He looked at the men, because cruelty only counts when it's witnessed. And Odom Hollis had built a whole career on making sure it was. Corporal Sela Duarte sat on an ammunition crate at the back of the tent and did not move. She was small enough that the plate carrier swallowed her. Small enough that new arrivals kept mistaking her for a clerk. Her hands rested open on her knees. Her breathing didn't change. To the men, it looked like she hadn't heard, or had heard, and swallowed it, one more insult sliding off a quiet woman who knew her place. That's not what it was. Her stillness was the stillness of someone who already knows how a thing is going to end and is only waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. She had read the map before Hollis started talking. She had read the harbor. She had read the long gray water beyond the breakwater, the swell rolling in off the open sea, and something in her had gone level and certain because water was the one language she'd spoken before she spoke any other. There was a line in her file that nobody in that tent believed. A range in another country, a shot logged off a moving deck that the graders had flagged twice for review because the math looked like a lie. They'd let it stand, and then quietly decided it must have been luck. Hollis had read the file. He'd decided the same. He did not yet know that in 9 hours he would say her name into a radio in front of 30 men and hate every syllable of it, because it would be the only sound in the world that could save them. Before we go further, if stories about the people everyone counts out, the ones who stay quiet while a room decides they're nothing, and then answer with the one thing that can't be argued with. If that's why you're here, do this now. Subscribe. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this one travels, because it travels far. And stay to the end, because what Sela Duarte does off a pitching harbor wall with a fire crawling toward 200 people is the kind of thing men will still be arguing about years later. And I'll show you exactly how she did it. And I'll show you the proof, because they're going to call it a lie too. Rewind 11 hours. The port city had been half drowned in war for a year, and the sea had never once stopped moving through it. This was not a place of dust and dry valleys. It was concrete gone green at the waterline, gantry cranes standing like dead giants over the container yards, warehouses with their roofs peeled back so the rain came straight down into them. Gulls still worked the wreckage. At dawn, the light came gray off the water and turned everything the color of an old coin. Sela liked it there in a way she never said out loud. It moved the way she understood movement. Everything on that waterfront rolled and settled and swung on some tide or wind. You could read if you'd grown up reading it, and she had. She hadn't learned to shoot in a school. She'd learned it on a fishing skiff before she was tall enough to see over the gunwale, culling the seals that tore the nets, her uncle screaming that she was wasting rounds, the deck never once holding still under her. You didn't get to wait for calm out there. Calm never came. You learned to feel where the boat was in its roll and let the round go in the half second the world handed you, and take it back if you missed, because there was always another swell and never enough shells. By the time the Army found her, she could do a thing with a rifle on moving ground that instructors couldn't teach because they'd never had to survive learning it. The one person who'd seen it for what it was, and not for how small she was a range master named Delia Cobb, a woman built like a fence post with a voice like gravel in a bucket. Cobb had no philosophy. Cobb had drills. She'd stood behind Sella on the qualification line the first week, watched her put 5 rounds into a group you could cover with a coin while the wind knocked the flags sideways, and instead of praising her, she'd cursed. "You're reading it and then rushing the send," Cobb had said. "Read it, then send it. Never the other way. You'll live longer, and so will everybody standing behind you." She'd made Sella say it back 100 times, until it stopped being words and became the thing Sella's hands did on their own. Read it, then send it. Cobb was still out there somewhere training the next class, blunt and alive and impossible to please. And part of Sella still wanted badly to make her nod once. That was the whole inheritance. No trinket, no keepsake pressed to the chest. Just a woman's rasping order living in her hands. That morning, 3 things happened that told the story of how the base saw her, and no 2 of them the same. The first was small. A supply corporal handed her a box of match-grade rounds and then took it back, apologizing, saying those were earmarked for the designated marksman, meaning Hollis, and here these would do, and gave her mixed lot ammunition, the kind you'd use to zero and throw away. She took it without a word. The second was louder. In the vehicle bay, Hollis held court, and when she passed, he asked the men, loud, whether anyone had told the new girl the harbor was salt water and not a swimming pool. And the men laughed the way men laugh when the biggest voice in the room needs them to. The third had no cruelty in it at all, which was somehow worse. Major Reston Dunham, who ran the whole show, walked past her twice in the operations tent, and both times his eyes slid over her and kept going, the way your eye slides over a chair. She was not worth dismissing. She was furniture, and Dunham, who could have set the tone for the whole base with one sentence, said nothing, because silence from the top of a chain is the same as permission, and every man under him had learned to read it. There was one person who read her differently. Private Teo Farrow, 19, on his first deployment, had watched her clean her rifle the night before under a work light in the maintenance bay. He didn't understand what he was seeing. He only knew that everyone else broke a weapon down like a chore. And she did it like it was a conversation. Her fingers finding things by feel, checking the crown of the muzzle against the light, running a bore snake, and then holding the rifle up and turning it a quarter degree at a time, reading something in the steel that he couldn't see. He'd asked her what she was looking for. She'd said, whether it's telling the truth. He hadn't known what that meant. He'd remember it later, in a way that would put a lump in his throat every time. She was still solo then. No spotter, no partner, no team. They hadn't given her one because you didn't waste a good spotter on a checkbox. So she did both jobs herself, the way she always had, her own eyes on the wind and the water and the trigger, and she told herself that was better anyway, because there was no one to slow her read. She didn't yet know that by nightfall, a whole strike team would be standing in a bay, refusing to load their trucks without her, and that the man who'd called her furniture would be the one who had to go find her. The routine broke at 11:40. It came as it always comes, sideways and too fast. A resupply convoy pushing through the port district on the coast road took fire at the old grain terminal and stopped being a convoy and started being targets. Enemy fighters had let the lead and rear trucks pass and then dropped a burning fuel bowser across the road behind them. And now they had 4 vehicles and 11 people boxed in a killing ground between the warehouses and the water, with gunners in the elevated windows working them over. The operations tent went from murmur to shouting inside 10 seconds. Dunham stood over the radio with his knuckles white on the table edge. The trapped element had a wounded man already. They had no overwatch. Every angle the base could think of onto those warehouse windows was blocked by the container stacks or too far to matter, and the one position that might work, the harbor mole, the long concrete arm that reached out into the swell, was exposed on 3 sides to the open sea, and nobody sane put a shooter out there in weather. Hollis said it couldn't be done from the mole. He said the wind off the water would make it a coin toss, and a coin toss got people killed. He was not entirely wrong, and that was the thing about Hollis you had to sit with. He was genuinely good. His dismissal of her had never been about her being bad. It had been a choice. Dunham looked around the tent for another answer, and didn't find one. And then his eye, for the first time, actually landed on the small woman standing by the tent flap, and stopped because some part of him had finally done the arithmetic. It cost him something to speak. You could see it cost him. Duarte, his jaw worked. That range report in your file, off the deck. A pause. That was its own admission. Was it real? Yes, sir. The mole. Can you make the windows from the mole? She was already moving toward her rifle. Yes, sir. I need better than yes. His voice cracked on it, because asking her better than yes meant admitting the room had been wrong about her for a month. Meant Hollis had been wrong. Meant he himself had walked past her twice like furniture. I need to know you can do a thing 3 of my best say can't be done. She stopped at the flap and looked back at him, and her voice was quiet and even, and carried to every corner of that tent. The water's rolling about a 2 count. I've been shooting off a 2 count my whole life. Put me on the mole. Nobody laughed this time. 12 minutes later, she keyed her radio for the first time, and the men who'd been calling her range trophy and new girl and furniture heard a voice they didn't recognize, because it had nothing soft in it at all. Overwatch is set. I have the warehouse windows. Tell your people to hold and stop moving so I can tell them apart from the ones I'm about to remove. The mole was worse than they'd said. She lay prone at the end of it on wet concrete, the swell breaking on the seaward side and throwing spray over her back in cold sheets, the whole world tilting under her in a slow, enormous rhythm as the sea worked the harbor. 410 meters to the grain terminal windows. The wind came across her firing line from the left, gusting, and the light was flat and gray and full of drifting smoke from the burning bowser. Hollis had been right that it should have been impossible. He'd only been wrong about who was lying on the concrete. Read it, then send it. She found the first gunner in a second-floor window, a man leaning into a belt-fed weapon, working long bursts down onto the trapped trucks, the ripping tear of it rolling across the water a half-second behind the muzzle flash. She let the mole rise and fall under her twice, feeling the swell, learning its 2 count, and on the third settle she sent the round in the still point at the bottom of the roll. The rifle bucked, a single deep crack that flattened out over the harbor. The gunner stopped. The belt-fed went silent. 1, she said to nobody, because there was nobody. She'd have to keep her own count. The base net crackled, and a voice, Pharaoh's, she'd learn later, who'd talked his way onto the radio, repeated it back like a prayer. Overwatch, that's one. The second window opened up before the echo died. She rode the swell down and sent another. 2. A third fighter broke from a doorway, trying to reach a better angle on the convoy, and she led him across the 2 count and dropped him mid-stride. 3. For 90 seconds she owned that waterfront, one deep report at a time. The count climbing steady, and on the base net, men were gathering around the speaker to listen to a woman they'd written off. Do the thing they'd all said couldn't be done. Every couple of shots she made the smallest adjustment for the wind seam that ran through the smoke. A hold she carried by feel, and each time a fighter thought the elevated windows were safe from the sea, he learned different. By the count of 9, the enemy understood where death was coming from, and the harbor changed its mind about her. A heavy gun she hadn't placed opened up from the container yard, a technical she'd missed behind the stacks, and it walked a line of fire straight out along the mole toward her. This is the first time she should have died. She heard the rounds before she understood them, a fast, wet slapping as they marched across the water, and then the concrete, a body length short of her, burst into stinging grit, and the air filled with the ring of steel gouging steel, where the rounds skipped off the mole and howled away over the swell. She felt the spray and the grit together on the back of her neck, and the deep cold of the water coming up through the concrete into her chest. And she did the only thing there was to do, which was to not do the thing everyone does, which is flinch and roll and run. She stayed. She pressed flat into the swell's rhythm and turned her head a few degrees and found the technical's muzzle flash strobing behind a gap in the container stacks, a gap 2 hands wide, and the base had already told her that angle didn't exist, that nothing on the friendly side of the harbor could reach a gun tucked back there. She read the geometry the way she read water. The gap wasn't square to her, but the swell was swinging her firing line by a slow degree as the mole rode the sea, and for one pass on each roll, the 2-hand gap opened just enough to line up on the gunner behind it. She waded through one full slap of the heavy gun, chewing the concrete closer, and on the swing she sent the round through the gap. The base said didn't exist. The heavy gun stopped. Somewhere in the operations tent, a man said, out loud, "That's not possible," and Dunham said nothing, because he'd stopped believing in the word. 10, Sella said. Her voice hadn't changed at all. She solved the thing they'd all said couldn't be solved, and she did it alone, and then she went back to work. The count climbed to 15, to 18. The fighters in the grain terminal, what was left of them, stopped trying for angles on the convoy, and started trying only to live. And one by one, they failed. Then her rifle ran dry of the good rounds. She'd been counting those, too. She always counted her rounds. It was the first drill Cobb ever beat into her. And she knew the mixed lot the supply corporal had shamed her with was all she had left. The throwaway ammunition, inconsistent, each round flying a little different from the last. A lesser shooter would have been finished. She simply changed how she thought. She stopped trusting the ammunition and started reading each round's flight off the last one, correcting on the fly, sending, watching, holding differently for the next, the way you'd fish an unfamiliar tide. 2 more windows went quiet. 19. The mixed lot cost her nothing but concentration, and she had that to spare. Then the convoy tried to move, because their vehicle commander thought the fire had lifted, and one of the trucks nosed out from cover and took a burst from a fighter she hadn't cleared yet, and a man went down on the road between the trucks, and that was the moment the operation stopped being about a count. She keyed the net. "Convoy, hold! Who's the man down?" Static, then a voice, tight. "Sergeant Merrick. Radio. He's hit and he's in the open." She knew Merrick. Everyone knew Merrick. Ivo Merrick was 46 years old and had been carrying a radio through worse than this since before Pharaoh was born. And he had a daughter finishing school back home. And a plan, a small, stupid, beautiful plan. He told anyone who'd stand still to buy a boat when he got out and take her fishing. A man who'd never fished a day in his life and had decided a boat was the shape his whole life was going to make once the war let him go. "Cover him," Sella said, and then she did something no one told her to do, and no one thought she'd do. She got up off the mole. She left the one safe thing, the prone position, the overwatch, and she came down off the harbor wall at a dead run into the killing ground. Her rifle slung, because the man in the open needed hands more than he needed a distant gun. And hers were the closest hands that knew what to do. This is the second time she should have died. Crossing 60 meters of open dock with a fighter still up somewhere in the terminal. She heard her own boots on wet concrete and the flat cracks of rifle fire starting to reach for her, rounds slapping the water to her right and spanging off a mooring bollard to her left with a ring like a struck bell. She felt the exposure on her skin like a physical weight, the whole open harbor watching her run. She calculated, as she moved, not whether to run, that was decided, but the line, the shortest cover-to-cover line, using the dead trucks as a rolling wall, timing her sprint across the last gap to the pause between the fighters' bursts, because even a scared man on a rifle breathes in a rhythm, and rhythms could be read. And then she did it, threw herself down behind the truck's engine block where Ivo Marek lay, and got her hands on him. He was fading, and there wasn't much time, and she could see it in his color, and the loose way his hand had gone. She didn't describe it to herself. She worked. This was the other thing in her hands the base didn't know about. The field medicine she'd drilled quietly for 2 years, and now her fingers moved fast and sure over the wound high in his thigh, finding it, packing it, getting her weight down on the pressure point, talking to him the whole time in a low, steady voice. "Ivo, stay with me. Look at me." His eyes came around, glassy. He got a word out. The girl? He meant his daughter. The boat. He tried to smile and couldn't manage it, and asked her the only question that mattered. In a whisper she had to lean down to catch. "Am I going to see the water again?" She did not hesitate, and she did not soften it into a maybe. She made it a fact, the way you state the tide. "You're going to buy that boat," she said. "You're going to teach her the 2 count off the stern, and she's going to be better than you inside a season. That's not a hope, Ivo. That's a schedule." He believed her because there was nothing in her voice that left room not to. She kept the pressure locked and called the case-vac line and read the enemy's remaining position off the sound of his fire without lifting her head. And when the fighter leaned out to try for the both of them, she took the carbine off her back. Not the deep, single crack of the bolt gun now, but the flatter, faster bark of the semi-auto, a different sound entirely rolling off the warehouses, and put 3 rounds through the doorway and ended it. 20, she said quietly, and it was the last of the first fight, and then she went back to holding Ivo Marek's life shut with her hands until the vehicles could roll and the medics could take him, and the guns finally, blessedly, stopped. They said it was over. The convoy consolidated and pushed clear, and the port district went quiet, except for the burning Bowser and the gulls coming back down. On the mole, Sella gathered her brass out of habit, and her hands, for the first time all day, shook once and then stopped. Pharaoh found her there 20 minutes later, sent down with water and a message, and he stood staring at the harbor she'd owned and couldn't find any of the words a person is supposed to have. She looked at him, this 19-year-old, still holding the water bottle out like an offering, and something in her softened for exactly one moment, the single moment of the whole day she let anyone see. She took the bottle, and she almost smiled, and she said, "You kept my count for me." It was the closest thing to affection she'd shown a living soul since she'd arrived, and Pharaoh would carry it the rest of his life. She thought she was done. She had earned done. She did not yet know the harbor had one more thing to ask of her, and that it would be worse. It came from the seaside, where nobody had been watching, and it came at dusk. The evacuation had been running quietly out of the ferry terminal all week, civilians and the wounded moving out to a hospital ship standing off the coast, and the last boat of the day was the old vehicle ferry Kestrine, riding low with more than 200 people aboard, evacuees and litter cases, held to the fuel jetty by her mooring lines, while the fighting up the coast road had kept her from casting off on schedule. Now, with the port district thought clear, the fighters who'd survived the grain terminal did the only thing they had left to do. They fell back to the fuel jetty, and they lit it. By the time the base understood, the fire was already in the fuel lines, running along the jetty toward the storage tanks, a low blue crawl of it eating along the pipework, and the Kestrine was pinned right beside it, unable to cast off, because the fighters had done one more thing before they ran. They'd fouled her stern line. The heavy pelican hook release that would let the ferry drop her last mooring and drift clear on the swell had a length of steel cable jammed hard through it, deliberately, and it sat 6 feet up the jetty piling, and the deck crew couldn't reach it, because a single fighter with a rifle had holed up in the terminal control room with a clean line onto that piling, and was cutting down anyone who tried. Everyone else had run. He'd stayed to make sure the ferry couldn't. He didn't need to hold long. The fire was doing the rest, and when it reached the tanks, the Kestrine and everyone on her would be inside it. This was the thing the first operation had only been rehearsal for. 211 people. A fire on a clock nobody could read exactly. A single fouled release 6 feet up a piling, and a gunman guarding it, and a fire between everyone and everything. Dunham stood up a quick reaction team in 90 seconds. And here is where the day turned all the way over, where the words Hollis had said at dawn came back and broke across the whole base like the swell across the mole. Because the QRT was Hollis's team, his 11, and when the tasking came down and the map went up and every one of them looked at the geometry of that jetty, the release 6 feet off the deck, the fire, the gunman, the swell, the fading light, and the fact that no boat could get close enough to that fouled hook to free it by hand before the fire arrived, that the only way anyone was getting that ferry loose was to shoot the jam free from across the harbor off unstable ground. Every one of them, all 11, turned and looked at the same person. The team leader, a level, hard corporal named Bram Ostwick, said it plain to Hollis and then to Dunham. "We're not going without Duarte on the glass. There's no point. We go without her. We're just going down there to watch 200 people burn up close." Hollis's face did something complicated. He had spent a month teaching this room that she was nothing. And now the room, his room, had decided in front of him that she was the only thing. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence had a weight to it, And everyone in that bay understood that Odom Hollis was being asked to unmake, out loud, the thing he'd built. He keyed the radio himself. He didn't hand it off. That mattered later when people told the story. The net was quiet, and then quieter. 3 full seconds of dead air, while a proud man went to war with himself. And every one of the 30-odd soldiers within earshot leaned in without meaning to, because they could hear him not speaking, and they knew what it was costing. "Duarte!" His voice came out wrong, scraped. "Sella!" He had never once used her first name. The Kestrines pinned at the fuel jetty, 211 souls, fires in the lines. Only way she drifts clear is somebody shoots the fouled release off the stern piling, 6 feet up, moving on the swell, with a shooter on it, and the lights going. A breath. Then the words that ended the man he'd been at dawn, and started the man he'd be after. "I can't make that shot. Nobody here can. I'm asking you, please." 200 men had heard him call her furniture. This time, the whole bay heard him say please, and nobody laughed, and nobody would ever laugh again. "Moving," Sella said. The team put her on a lighter, a small harbor workboat, because the only firing position with an angle on that stern piling was out on the water itself, off the swell, off the exact kind of pitching deck the graders had once flagged in her file as a lie. The whole story had been pointing here the entire time, and none of them had known it. Pharaoh came with her, and Ostwick, and a fighter of Ostwick's who'd grown up on trawlers and could read the sea nearly as well as she could. The lighter's engine growled them out into the harbor, while the fire's glow climbed the fuel tanks, and the Kestrine sat huge and helpless in the failing light with her decks full of people you could now hear. A low collective sound of 200 human beings understanding what the fire meant. They had one problem that had no answer, and Sela found it in the first 10 seconds of glassing the piling, and it was the thing that made the shot a shot no sane person would attempt. The fouled release was tucked in against the piling. From every stable angle, a piece of the jetty structure or a knot of the Kestrine's own deck crew, still trying by hand to work the jam loose, sat directly behind or beside it. She could not send a round at that hook without a person in the danger space, and the round would go somewhere after it did its work. And the whole world was moving, the lighter under her on the swell, the ferry rising and falling against the piling on the same swell, but a half beat off, and the smoke from the fire drifting across the firing line in slow banks that opened and closed the sight picture. Distance was nothing, 300 meters. Distance had never been the problem. The problem was a target the size of a fist, on 2 things moving out of phase, behind people, in smoke, in the dark. Ostwick's trawlerman, Jans, read the swell aloud beside her, and Pharaoh watched the deck crew through the spare optic and called their movement. And Selah herself watched the one thing that would decide everything, which was the Kestrine's own motion on her last remaining line. Because here was the reed, and it was not a window in the wind, and it was not a cycle you could count off. It was one thing once. The ferry was swinging on her single, fouled stern line like a boat on an anchor, penduluming slow across the swell. And Jans and Sela both saw the same truth at the same moment. She was fetching up. Each swing was shorter than the last, as the fire-driven current and the failing swell settled her back against the piling for the final time. On the next swing, the last real swing before the Kestrine came to rest hard against the jetty and buried the release forever against the piling where no round could reach it. The stern would pendulum out, and, for the length of a single slow pass, Carry the fouled hook clear of the piling, clear of the deck crew, out into open air against the dark water, where a round could take it and pass on into nothing but harbor behind. One pass. It would not come again. If she read it wrong or waited for a better one, the ferry would settle and the fire would reach the tanks, and that would be the end. "That's the one," Yance breathed. "She won't swing out that far again. She's done after this." "Deck crew's clear on the outswing," Pharaoh said, voice shaking, "for maybe 2 seconds, then they're back on it. Read it, then send it. Never the other way." Sella set her weight into the lighter's roll and stopped fighting it and became part of it, the way she'd been part of a boat before she had words, and she brought the fouled hook into the sight and let everything else fall away. The fire, the 200 voices, Hollis's pleas still hanging in her chest, the whole month of being furniture. There was only the hook and the swing beginning, and the 2 motions of the 2 boats sliding toward the one instant they'd agree. The ferry began her last long pendulum out. The hook came off the piling and into open air. The deck crew flinched back. The smoke, for one breath, thinned. The lighter under her rolled down toward the bottom of its own swell, the still point she'd been reading her whole life, and at the bottom of it, in the half-second the sea handed her, and would not hand her twice, with the hook crossing clear against black water, and the world holding still inside all that motion, she sent the round. The deep crack of the bolt gun went out across the harbor and came back off the fuel tanks. The fouled cable, the jam, the thing 200 lives hung on, snapped free of the pelican hook, and the hook flew open, and the Kestrine's last line dropped away, and the great dark hull, released, began to drift out on the swell away from the jetty, away from the fire, out into the safe black water of the harbor, with 211 people aboard her, slow and enormous and alive. A sound came up off her decks that Pharaoh said afterward he'd never be able to describe to anyone, and behind her the fire reached the tanks a full 90 seconds later and lit the whole sky orange over water that no longer had a ferry in it. For a while, nobody on the lighter said anything at all. They said it couldn't have happened, of course, the way they always do. Word got back to base ahead of the boat, and half the operations tent flatly refused to believe a round had severed a jammed cable off a pelican hook from a moving boat onto a moving boat in the dark, past a deck crew in smoke. There were men who'd heard the whole thing on the net and still stood there and said it must have been the fire that weakened the cable, or the swell that shook the jam loose, that the shot had missed, and the ferry had drifted free on its own, and Duarte was taking credit. Hollis, of all people, was the one who ended that, because the QRT hadn't gone in blind. Ostwick's team had run a small ISR bird over the harbor the whole time, and the feed had caught it, grainy and thermal and undeniable. The hook, the swing, the single bright bloom of the round striking home, the cable parting in the same frame. They played it in the operations tent, and the room went silent. And then the boat crews recovered the pelican hook itself the next morning off the drifting Kestrine, and the fouled cable was still hanging from it, cut clean through by a single round, the strike mark bright on the steel where no fire and no swell could have put it, and the ferry master and his whole deck crew, 24 adults who'd been standing 3 feet from the piling, told the same story without ever having compared it. One crack from the water, and the hook opened. 3 independent things, all pointing at one truth. The footage, the recovered hook, and 24 witnesses. It stopped being a fish story that night. It became the thing men on that base measured every other shot against for the rest of the war. They tallied it at the end, the ordinary count, the whole number arithmetic of the first fight, and the fighters cleared off the terminal in the second before the ferry broke loose. 31 confirmed. A number. A real, sober, terrible number. And everyone respected it. But it was never the number people meant when they told the story. The number people meant was 211. And that number wasn't on any tally at all because it was the count of the people who lived. And you don't put the living on a scoreboard. Sella came back off the water in the dark and walked up the jetty ramp with her rifle slung and her face level, and Odom Hollis was standing at the top of it waiting for her. He had rehearsed nothing. You could see that. Whatever he'd meant to say had left him, and what was left was just a big loud man who'd spent a month being wrong in front of everyone and had watched, tonight, exactly how wrong. He opened his mouth and closed it. His hands, those steady marksman's hands, would not stay still at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice came out in pieces, starting and stopping, nothing like the flat, certain instrument that had called her a checkbox at dawn. I said, he stopped, tried again. At the briefing, this morning. I said, he couldn't finish the sentence, and it turned out he didn't need to, because the not finishing was the apology. The great vain voice failing in front of witnesses the same way it had performed in front of them. And everyone standing there understood that the failing was the truest thing Hollis had ever offered. He looked at the water, and then he made himself look at her, which cost him more than the words had. I was so sure, he said, low, wrecked. I was so sure, and I never once looked. 211 people are alive because you're better than me, and I spent a month making sure everybody knew you weren't fit to be here. His jaw shook. I don't know how to say the size of it. I'm not going to try to make it smaller than it is by listing it out. I was wrong about you all the way down. That's all. I was wrong all the way down. Sella looked at him for a long moment. The swell slapped at the jetty below them. She didn't tell him it was fine, because it hadn't been. She didn't make him feel better, because that wasn't her job, and it would have been a lie. She gave him the only thing that was true. 2 words, quiet, even, and complete. Now you looked. That was all. And it was enough, and it was more than he deserved, and he knew it, and he nodded and couldn't speak, and turned away with his eyes wet. Dunham found her a minute later. He didn't make a ceremony of it, because she wasn't a ceremony kind of soldier, and he'd finally learned to read that too. He just stood beside her at the top of the ramp and looked out at the Kestrine, riding safe and dark on the far water. There's a marksman element I've been meaning to stand up, he said. Its own tasking authority, its own selection. I want you to build it and run it. Sergeant's stripes come with it, effective now. A beat. I walked past you twice this morning. I'm the reason a room full of men thought they were allowed to. That won't happen on my base again. He didn't dress it up past that, and she respected him more for it than she would have for a speech. Understood, sir, she said. Just that. Farrow was the one who put words to the thing nobody else could. He came and stood with her, while the base wound down around them, and he wasn't a boy who could hold a big feeling quiet, so he didn't try. Sergeant Merrick's on the hospital ship, he said. He's going to make it. The doc said another few minutes, and he wouldn't have. His voice thickened. His daughter's going to have her dad walk her out of school. 210 other people are going to see whoever they were running home to. And every single one of them thinks the whole world tried to save them tonight. He looked at her, 19 and undone by it. They don't know it was one person. They don't know it was the one person everybody said didn't belong here. But it was. It was just you. Sela didn't answer that right away. She watched the harbor she'd read all her life, the swell rolling in off the open sea, patient and endless, the thing that had taught her the only lesson that had ever mattered. When she spoke, it wasn't really to Pharaoh. It was the thing Cobb had put in her hands, come all the way around into words. "Everybody wanted me to be fast this morning," she said. "Fast is how you miss. You read it first. You wait for the one you're actually given, not the one you wish for. Then you send it." She let out a slow breath. "They spent a month deciding I was nothing because I was quiet and I was small, and I waited. The quiet and the small and the waiting were the whole reason. Those people are alive. That was never a weakness they were kind enough to overlook. That was the weapon. They just couldn't see it, so they decided it wasn't there." She cleaned her rifle that night under the same work light where Pharaoh had first watched her, turning the steel a quarter degree at a time, reading whether it was telling the truth. Her hands, doing the thing Delia Cobb's rasp still lived inside of. Then she slung it and walked out to the harbor wall in the dark. Alone, the way she'd started, in motion, and utterly still at the same time. Her eyes level on the water, and something in her had come to rest that had been standing on edge for a long time before this base and this war. She had made the base's own strike team refuse to move without her. She had made the loudest man on it say please, and then say he was wrong all the way down. She had earned, out here at the edge of the moving sea, a quiet that no one could take back. And somewhere behind her, in a dark tent, Odom Hollis lay awake and could not find, anywhere in himself, the certainty he'd carried into that briefing at dawn. He turned the morning over and over, looking for the man who'd said she doesn't belong here and could not locate him, because that man was gone, drowned in the same harbor that had shown everyone at last exactly where Sela Duarte belonged, which was wherever the impossible thing was, doing it, quiet, while the rest of them learned how to look.